The sun beat down on the small-town high school football field, its bleachers already filling with students, parents, and community members who had come to watch the Friday night game. It was more than just a match. It was the weekly ritual, the place where social circles were formed, reputations built, and judgments handed out like concessions from the snack bar. Among the crowd of cheerleaders, band members, and athletes, there was one figure who stood out for reasons that had nothing to do with popularity or glamour. Her name was Kayla Henderson, a junior who had always been more comfortable in the quiet woods outside of town than in the noisy chatter of teenage cliques. That evening, instead of jeans and a spirit shirt like most of her classmates, she wore her favorite camouflage jacket and boots, a look that made perfect sense to her because she spent her weekends hunting with her father and hiking trails most of the others had never even heard of. But to the girls behind her in the bleachers, it was an open invitation for ridicule. The first snicker came when she walked past the concession stand, a group of cheerleaders exchanging glances before one said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "What is this, the Army surplus fashion show?" A burst of laughter followed, sharp and unkind, and Kayla's face flushed though she kept walking. She had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse, that standing tall and pretending not to hear gave her at least some measure of dignity, but the sting of their words still cut deep. By the time she sat down near the 50-yard line with her small group of friends, the whispers had already spread. Boys nudged each other and smirked, some tossing mock salutes in her direction. A few even hummed military marching songs under their breath as they passed. Kayla adjusted her jacket, staring hard at the field as if focusing on the players warming up would shield her from the storm of judgment that seemed to close in from all sides. Inside, she was torn between pride in who she was and a sinking weight of humiliation that pressed against her ribs like a stone. Her best friend Marissa leaned closer and whispered, "Don't let them get to you. You look fine. You look like yourself." But Kayla only managed a weak smile. The truth was, in this town, being yourself was often the quickest way to become a target. The school prided itself on its sports teams, its cheer squad, and its homecoming traditions. Anyone who didn't fit neatly into those molds was left to stand on the edges, tolerated at best and mocked at worst. Tonight felt like one of those nights where the spotlight of ridicule had been aimed directly at her. As the game began, the laughter subsided into background noise, replaced by cheers and the rumble of feet stomping on metal bleachers. For a while Kayla was able to lose herself in the rhythm of the plays, the whistle blasts, the marching band echoing across the field. Yet even then she could feel eyes on her, waiting for her to provide more fuel for their jokes. What none of them knew, what they couldn't even imagine, was that the camouflage she wore wasn't some misguided fashion choice. It was a quiet symbol of the life she lived outside of these narrow high school walls. Her father was a decorated Army veteran who had taught her to respect discipline, resilience, and the ability to survive in situations where others might crumble. Her jacket was more than fabric. It was a reminder of the bond they shared, of weekends spent rising before dawn, of whispered lessons in the woods about patience and awareness, of stories told by campfires that lit up the night. Every stitch held meaning, and though Kayla couldn't explain that to people who only saw camouflage as something to laugh at, she carried it close to her heart like a shield. The first half of the game passed slowly, the home team trailing by a touchdown, the crowd's energy dipping into restless chatter. Kayla's classmates made a few more cracks about her outfit, one even shouting across the bleachers, "Careful, she might start crawling on her belly across the 50-yard line." The laughter was loud and cruel, and Kayla clenched her fists beneath the bench, fighting the urge to cry. Her father's words echoed in her head, words he had repeated during long hikes when her legs ached and she wanted to give up. "Strength isn't about proving yourself to them, Kayla. It's about proving to yourself that you won't break." She breathed deeply, focusing on those words, on the cool night air, on the steady rhythm of her heart. Then, just as halftime arrived and the band began to assemble at the edge of the field, a low, growing rumble filled the air. At first people thought it was part of the show, maybe fireworks or a recording, but the vibration quickly grew stronger, rattling the bleachers and sending shivers through the crowd. Heads tilted upward as a dark shape emerged from the night sky, its lights cutting through the darkness. Within seconds, the unmistakable silhouette of a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter descended over the field, its rotors chopping the air with deafening power. Gasps rippled through the stadium as the massive aircraft hovered above the 50-yard line, kicking up dust and sending banners flapping wildly. Players froze in the middle of the field, cheerleaders shielded their faces from the gusts, and every mocking voice that had ridiculed Kayla moments earlier fell silent. Her eyes widened, her heart pounding as the machine settled lower and lower, until with a thundering rush it landed right on the painted turf, the school logo nearly swallowed beneath its shadow. For a moment, the entire crowd seemed suspended in disbelief, stunned into silence by the surreal spectacle before them. The roar of the helicopter's engine drowned out the band, the announcer, and even the stunned gasps of the crowd as the Black Hawk's wheels pressed firmly onto the turf, sending a blast of hot air across the field. Dust and loose papers swirled through the bleachers while the players stood frozen in disbelief, helmets tucked under their arms, unsure whether to cheer or run. For Kayla, time seemed to move in slow motion as her classmates stared at the massive aircraft that had just shattered the ordinary rhythm of their Friday night ritual. The mocking laughter that had echoed only minutes ago was gone, replaced by slack-jawed silence and wide-eyed wonder. Then the side door of the helicopter slid open, and out stepped a tall man in full Army combat uniform, his presence commanding attention even before he reached the ground. The insignia on his chest gleamed under the stadium lights, his movements steady and sure despite the noise and chaos of the landing. He walked with the kind of confidence that only came from years of discipline and service, the kind Kayla knew all too well because she had grown up watching it at her own kitchen table. As he stepped onto the grass, the crowd erupted in confused murmurs, some asking aloud what was happening, others craning their necks to get a better look. The man didn't head toward the coaches, the principal, or the mayor, who was known to attend every home game. Instead, his eyes swept the bleachers until they locked onto a single figure. Kayla felt her breath catch as she realized he was looking directly at her. The whispers around her swelled into a roar as he began to walk across the field toward her, his boots thudding with purpose against the ground, the soldiers inside the Black Hawk watching silently from the open door. Every step he took seemed to amplify the tension in the stadium until all anyone could hear was the rhythmic pounding of his boots and the whir of the helicopter blades overhead. Kayla's hands trembled in her lap, her heart hammering in her chest, and for a moment she wished she could sink into the bench and disappear. Yet when Marissa whispered, "Kayla, he's coming for you," something inside her shifted. She straightened her back, swallowed hard, and forced herself to meet his gaze. When he finally reached the bleachers, the murmurs died down once more. He climbed the steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood right in front of her, the soldier's uniform cutting a striking contrast against the sea of jerseys, band outfits, and cheer uniforms that surrounded them. Without hesitation he saluted her. A sharp, precise motion that carried the weight of respect and honor in every inch. The crowd gasped in unison, unable to comprehend why this imposing figure would single out the quiet girl in camouflage who had been the butt of their jokes only minutes earlier. Kayla, stunned, returned the salute almost instinctively, a movement she had practiced countless times in the backyard with her father when he told her stories of his service. The soldier's stern face softened into a small smile, and then he spoke in a voice that carried over the murmuring crowd. "Your father asked me to deliver a message," he said, his tone respectful but firm. Kayla's throat tightened and she struggled to find her voice as she whispered back, "My father?" The soldier nodded. "He wanted you to know that he's proud of you. That no matter what anyone says, you should always wear your strength with pride. He couldn't be here tonight, so he asked me to come instead." The words hit her with a force greater than the helicopter's gusts, tears springing to her eyes as the weight of his message sank in. Her father, deployed overseas, had found a way to remind her that she wasn't alone, that the values he had instilled in her weren't something to be ashamed of but something to stand tall with. The crowd sat in stunned silence, every mocking word they had thrown at her suddenly sounding hollow in the wake of this soldier's respect. Some students shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away, while others stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Kayla's camouflage jacket, once the source of their ridicule, now seemed to shine with new meaning under the stadium lights. The soldier reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded flag, carefully placing it in her hands. "He wanted you to have this until he comes home," he said, his voice steady despite the noise around them. Kayla's fingers curled around the flag, her tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." The man gave her one last nod before stepping back, his boots echoing against the bleachers as he returned to the field. The crowd erupted, not with laughter this time, but with applause that spread like wildfire through the stadium. Parents stood, clapping with pride, students cheered, and even the players on the sidelines banged their helmets together in rhythm. The Black Hawk's engines roared louder as the soldier climbed back inside, the door sliding shut with finality. With a thunderous lift, the helicopter rose into the air once more, its shadow sweeping across the field before it disappeared into the night sky. Kayla sat frozen, the flag clutched tightly in her hands, her heart overflowing with emotions she could barely process. Around her, the same people who had mocked her moments before were now leaning in, their voices filled with awe, curiosity, and newfound respect. For the first time in years, Kayla didn't feel like the outsider, the odd one out, or the target of ridicule. She felt seen, respected, and connected to something larger than the narrow world of high school popularity. And as she sat there, the thunder of the helicopter fading into the distance, she realized that her camouflage had never been about blending in, it had always been about standing strong, even when others couldn't understand why. The roar of the helicopter faded into the distance. The football field seemed to fall into an unnatural quiet, as though the entire stadium was holding its breath. The cheerleaders lowered their pom-poms, the band members fumbled with their instruments, and even the announcer in the press box was speechless. Kayla sat rigid in her seat, the folded flag still pressed tightly against her chest, her camouflage jacket rippling gently in the lingering wind from the rotors. It was as if the world had shifted in the span of a few minutes, and everyone present felt it. The same crowd that had mocked her just an hour earlier now looked at her with wide eyes, whispers threading through the stands. "Did you see that?" someone muttered. "He saluted her." Another voice followed, "Her dad must be a soldier." The word spread quickly, carried on the current of gossip that normally fueled high school drama, but tonight it carried something different. Something heavier, something respectful. Kayla, however, wasn't listening. Her mind was a storm of emotions she couldn't quite name. Pride, relief, and a deep ache of longing for her father all swirled together until she felt like she might burst. She could still hear his voice in her head, the memory of his steady tone when he had told her before his last deployment. "When people don't understand you, Kayla, remember that doesn't make you wrong. It makes you strong." Now, in front of everyone who had doubted her, those words had been proven true in the most spectacular way. The game, almost forgotten, stumbled back into motion as the teams returned to the field, but the energy was completely different. Where earlier the bleachers had been filled with laughter at her expense, now there was a strange reverence, as if everyone had silently agreed that something sacred had happened and none of them wanted to break it. Players stole glances at her from the sidelines, and the cheerleaders who had mocked her at the concession stand now kept their eyes fixed anywhere but in her direction. For Kayla, it felt surreal, as if she were walking in two worlds at once. The familiar one where she was the quiet, awkward girl who spent her weekends in the woods, and this new one where she carried a flag handed to her in front of the entire town by a soldier stepping out of a Black Hawk. She wondered what her father would say if he knew, and then remembered with a rush of emotion that of course he did know. This hadn't been an accident. This had been his doing. The thought made her smile through her tears, and she pressed the flag tighter against her heart. Marissa leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kayla, I don't even know what to say. That was incredible." Kayla managed a small laugh, her voice trembling as she answered, "I don't either." She wanted to tell her best friend everything, that the jacket wasn't just a piece of clothing, that every time she wore it she felt close to her father, that she never cared about fitting in because her world was bigger than football games and pep rallies, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't need to explain now, not after what had just happened. The explanation had been written in the sky, delivered in thunder and steel for everyone to see. As the second half of the game dragged on, Kayla found herself only half paying attention. The crowd cheered, touchdowns were scored, and the scoreboard ticked upward, but none of it seemed to matter. Her thoughts were elsewhere, with her father thousands of miles away, picturing him in uniform, somewhere far more dangerous than a football field, trusting that his daughter would carry his message with strength. She wondered how he had arranged this, who he had contacted, how much effort it must have taken. That soldier hadn't just appeared for show. He had carried with him the weight of her father's pride, and Kayla knew it had taken planning, coordination, and trust. That realization filled her with awe. By the time the game ended and the home team claimed a narrow victory, the buzz in the stands had shifted from the score to the spectacle they had witnessed. Groups of students clustered together, whispering excitedly about the Black Hawk, replaying the moment over and over as though trying to etch it permanently into their memories. Kayla moved slowly down the bleachers, the flag still in her arms, her boots clattering softly against the metal steps. People parted for her without a word, their eyes following her with something between respect and guilt. A few murmured, "Hey, that was awesome," or, "Tell your dad thank you for his service," but most simply stayed quiet, their earlier ridicule weighing on them too heavily to allow easy words. When she reached the parking lot, the night air felt cooler, the sky wide and star-filled above her. She paused, looking back at the stadium glowing under the lights, the field where everything had changed. For so long she had dreaded these nights, knowing they meant another round of whispers and stares, but now she realized she would never see it the same way again. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't a joke. She was the daughter of a man who had served his country with honor, and tonight that honor had been passed to her in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. As she slid into the passenger seat of Marissa's car, she let out a shaky laugh. "Well," she said, her voice breaking, "that's one football game I'll never forget." Marissa started the car, shaking her head in disbelief. "Forget? Kayla, they'll be talking about this for years." Kayla turned to the window, watching the stadium fade into the distance. The folded flag rested in her lap, her hands covering it protectively, and for the first time in a long time she felt no shame, no self-doubt. Only strength, only pride, only a connection that reached far beyond the noise of high school and into the heart of who she truly was. The following week at school felt like stepping into a different world for Kayla. For years she had been used to slipping through the halls unnoticed except for the occasional snide comment, but now every corner she turned seemed to hold a pair of eyes waiting to catch a glimpse of her. Students who had never spoken to her before suddenly offered small nods of respect, or whispered to each other when she passed, their voices carrying words like, "That's her," and "the helicopter girl." It was strange, unsettling even, to have the spotlight turned on her in such a way, but what surprised her most was that it wasn't the usual cruel spotlight that burned with ridicule. This one felt warmer, softer, filled with curiosity and even admiration. Still, it was hard for Kayla to accept. She wasn't used to being treated like someone important, and part of her resisted it. In her mind she was still the same girl who spent weekends trudging through the forest with her dad's old compass, who preferred the quiet rustle of leaves to the roar of bleachers, who found peace in the stillness of dawn with a fishing pole in her hand. She hadn't changed overnight, but everyone's perception of her had, and adjusting to that shift was harder than she had expected. In English class, a boy who had once mocked her boots raised his hand to ask a question, then turned to her as though seeking her approval after giving his answer. At lunch, one of the cheerleaders who had laughed the loudest the night of the game slid her tray onto Kayla's table with a hesitant smile, acting as though they had been friends for years. "That was amazing," she said softly, almost apologetically. Kayla nodded politely but kept her focus on her food, unsure how to respond to someone whose laughter had once cut so deep. Marissa leaned across the table, whispering, "You know they're all trying to make up for it, right?" Kayla gave her a small shrug. "Maybe," she said, "but it doesn't erase how they treated me before." The truth of that statement sat heavily between them. Respect earned through spectacle was fragile. Kayla knew it could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. The only thing she could trust to last was the strength she carried within herself, the strength her father had built in her since she was a child. Even so, part of her couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. She had endured years of jokes, whispers, and dismissive looks, and in one night her father had turned all of it on its head. The same jacket they had mocked now seemed to command silence when she wore it through the halls, and the same boots that had earned her ridicule now clicked against the tile with a rhythm that made people step aside. But Kayla never wore them for anyone else. She wore them because they made her feel close to him, because they reminded her of the values he had passed on, because they were hers. That hadn't changed. What had changed, however, was how much she thought about him now. Every night after her homework was done, she would sit by the window with the folded flag on her lap, running her fingers over the fabric, imagining him somewhere under the same stars. Sometimes she would write letters she couldn't send, pages filled with the things she wanted to tell him. How the helicopter had silenced the laughter, how proud she was to be his daughter, how she wished he could be there to see it himself. She tucked the letters into a box beneath her bed, saving them for the day he would come home. On Friday morning, the principal's voice crackled over the intercom announcing the upcoming Veterans Day Assembly, a tradition the school held every year, though most students usually saw it as nothing more than a chance to skip class for an hour. This year, though, the announcement carried a different weight. Kayla felt the eyes on her immediately, dozens of heads turning in her direction as if to silently suggest she would be at the center of it. Her stomach twisted at the thought. The idea of standing in front of the entire school made her chest tighten with nerves, but deep down she knew she couldn't avoid it. Her story had already been written in the night sky by the thunder of rotor blades. When the day of the assembly came, the gym was filled wall to wall with students, teachers, and veterans from the community. Flags lined the stage, and the sound of the band playing patriotic music echoed through the space. Kayla sat in the front row, her camouflage jacket crisp and her boots polished, the folded flag resting carefully in her hands. She had been asked to speak, and though every instinct in her told her to run, she couldn't. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about him. When her name was called, she stood slowly, her legs trembling, her throat dry. The microphone seemed impossibly large as she stepped toward it, the faces of hundreds staring back at her. For a moment, panic gripped her chest, but then she felt the weight of the flag in her hands and remembered her father's voice. She cleared her throat, her voice shaky at first but growing steadier with each word. She told them about her dad, about the lessons he had taught her, about the strength he carried into every challenge and the pride he left with her even in his absence. She told them what the camouflage meant to her, that it wasn't about hiding but about carrying forward the spirit of someone she loved and respected. By the time she finished, the gym was silent except for the sound of her voice, and when she stepped back, the silence shattered into thunderous applause. She had walked in feeling like a target. She walked out feeling like a symbol. After the assembly, Kayla walked through the halls in a daze, her heart still racing from the weight of what she had just done. Speaking in front of the entire school had been something she had never imagined herself capable of, but now that it was behind her, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Students she barely knew stopped her in the hall to shake her hand, pat her shoulder, or tell her she had spoken beautifully. Teachers smiled at her with newfound admiration, some even calling her an inspiration. Yet Kayla couldn't help but feel conflicted. She hadn't spoken to gain recognition or applause, she had spoken because she wanted to honor her father. All the noise of admiration around her felt strange, almost hollow, compared to the quiet, steady pride she imagined in his heart when he heard what she had said. That night, she lay in bed with the flag resting on her chest and thought about the years to come. Her father would be gone for months still, maybe longer, and she wondered how many more football games, assemblies, and school days she would have to walk through without him. The thought was heavy, but she reminded herself of what he had taught her. Strength wasn't about the absence of struggle but about enduring through it. She knew she had to keep moving, not for the approval of her classmates, but for herself and for him. The next few weeks brought subtle changes. Students who had once avoided her now invited her to sit with them at lunch, and some of the boys who had mocked her camo now seemed almost embarrassed when they passed her in the halls. Kayla accepted their gestures with grace but kept her circle small. She knew better than to be swept up in the shallow tides of high school popularity. Instead, she poured her energy into her classes, into her friendship with Marissa, and into the quiet rituals that reminded her of her father. Every weekend she still went hiking in the woods, still wore her camouflage jacket proudly, still rose early to sit on the porch with a cup of tea as the sun came up. These habits grounded her, keeping her connected to the man who had shaped her life even while he was far away. But not everyone was quick to accept the change. There were still whispers from a few who resented the attention she had received, who muttered that she was milking it, or acting like she was special just because her dad was a soldier. Kayla overheard them sometimes in the cafeteria or near her locker, and though the words stung, she held her head high and walked past. She had learned something important that night on the football field. The world would always have people who didn't understand, but their misunderstanding no longer had the power to define her. One afternoon, as she sat under the bleachers waiting for Marissa, she took out one of her unsent letters to her father and read it over. The paper was worn from being folded and unfolded so many times, the ink smudged from her fingers. She had written about the helicopter landing, about the soldiers' salute, about the way the crowd had changed. As she read, she felt a lump rise in her throat, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was from gratitude, gratitude for the chance to carry a piece of her father with her every day, gratitude for the strength he had given her. She tucked the letter back into her bag just as Marissa arrived, her voice breathless. "You won't believe this," Marissa said, holding out her phone. On the screen was a message from the local news station. They wanted to interview Kayla about the Black Hawk landing and the speech she had given at the assembly. The thought of cameras and microphones made Kayla's stomach churn, but she knew she couldn't hide from it forever. This wasn't about fame. It was about sharing the truth of what had happened, about honoring not just her father but all the men and women who served like him. Reluctantly, she agreed, and a week later she found herself sitting in front of a reporter, her camouflage jacket buttoned neatly, the folded flag on her lap. The reporter asked about the helicopter, about the salute, about what it had meant to her. Kayla answered as honestly as she could, her voice steady, her words filled with the same sincerity that had carried her through the assembly. When the interview aired, families across town watched it, and suddenly Kayla's story was no longer just a piece of school gossip. It was a story that touched the whole community. Veterans stopped her in the grocery store to shake her hand, parents told their children about the importance of respect and pride, and teachers used her speech as an example of courage. For Kayla, it was overwhelming at times, but she reminded herself again and again that this wasn't really about her. It was about the values she carried from her father, values that mattered far more than popularity or attention. One evening, weeks after the interview, Kayla sat alone on the porch as the sun set, the sky streaked with orange and gold. She held the flag close, listening to the sound of the wind in the trees, imagining it was the echo of rotor blades in the distance. She closed her eyes and whispered into the fading light, "I hope you know, Dad. I hope you know how proud I am of you, and how much I'll always carry what you taught me." In that quiet moment, with the world hushed around her, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The laughter, the ridicule, the cruelty of her classmates, it had all been noise. The helicopter, the salute, the applause, it had been powerful, but it too was only a moment. What truly mattered was the unshakable bond between her and her father, the lessons he had given her that would never fade. No matter how the world around her shifted, winter crept over the small town, bringing with it the bite of cold air and the hush of snow that blanketed the fields and rooftops. For Kayla, the season always felt heavier without her father around. Christmas lights twinkled on the houses lining the street, families bustled through stores with arms full of gifts, and the sound of carols drifted from radios, but none of it quite filled the space he left behind. Still, she did her best to hold on to the warmth of his presence in her own way. She wore his old dog tags beneath her jacket, kept the folded flag close to her bed, and whispered prayers for his safety into the night sky. At school, the buzz of her story hadn't completely faded. Though the whispers weren't as frequent as they had been right after the helicopter landed, people still regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Some asked polite questions about her father, others simply nodded when they passed in the hall, but what struck her most was how much more careful people seemed around her now. The cruel jokes had stopped entirely, as if no one dared risk reopening the wound they had all witnessed being healed in such a dramatic fashion. And yet, Kayla never let herself believe she was untouchable. High school was fickle. Respect could turn to ridicule in an instant. The only thing she trusted was the steadiness of the values her father had instilled in her, values that didn't rise and fall with popularity. When the first snow fell, Kayla and Marissa bundled up in thick jackets and trudged into the woods behind Kayla's house. It was their tradition, one that Kayla insisted on keeping no matter how busy or cold things got. The forest, quiet under its blanket of white, gave her peace in a way no classroom or cafeteria ever could. As they walked, Marissa finally broke the silence. "You know you've changed," she said, crunching through the snow. "Not in a bad way. It's just, you seem stronger now. Like nothing can really touch you anymore." Kayla smiled faintly, adjusting the scarf around her neck. "I don't feel strong all the time," she admitted. "Most days I miss him so much it hurts. But I guess I learned that missing someone doesn't have to make you weaker. It can remind you why you need to keep going." Marissa nodded thoughtfully, and they continued in silence for a while. Later that night, after Marissa had gone home, Kayla sat at her desk with another letter she couldn't send. She wrote about the assembly, about the interview, about the way her classmates had shifted and how they treated her. But she also wrote about the loneliness, about the ache of watching other kids hug their dads after games or see them sitting proudly in the stands. "Sometimes," she wrote, "I wish you could have been there yourself instead of sending someone in your place. But then I think maybe that's the lesson. You've been teaching me my whole life how to be strong without you holding my hand. And I'm trying, Dad. I really am." She folded the letter neatly and slipped it into the box under her bed, stacking it on top of the others. By now, the box was almost full, a hidden archive of her heart spilled onto paper. That weekend, her mother surprised her with news. "We're going to a base ceremony next month," she said as they sat at the kitchen table, mugs of cocoa steaming between them. "They've invited families to come and they're going to honor the soldiers currently deployed. Your dad's unit will be recognized." Kayla's heart leapt at the thought. The idea of standing among others who understood the same longing, the same sacrifices, filled her with a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she craved. When the day arrived, she wore her camouflage jacket proudly, the dog tags around her neck, and the flag carefully folded in her arms. The base was buzzing with families, each carrying their own stories of absence and hope, each face marked by the same mixture of pride and worry she knew so well. As the ceremony began, she listened to the speeches about service, sacrifice, and honor, and for the first time she felt surrounded by people who truly understood what it meant to live in the shadow of deployment. When the national anthem played, she stood tall, clutching the flag to her chest, tears brimming in her eyes. She wasn't crying out of sadness but out of pride. Pride in her father, pride in the values he had given her, pride in the resilience that bound all of them together. After the ceremony, a woman approached her, her face lined with years of waiting and worrying. "You're the girl from the football game, aren't you?" she asked gently. Kayla nodded, surprised. The woman smiled faintly. "My son is with your father's unit." What you did that night and what you said at the assembly, it gave us all a little more strength. Thank you. Kayla was stunned, unable to find words, but she nodded and hugged the woman tightly. For the first time, she realized her story wasn't just her own. It was connected to countless others who carried the same weight, who needed reminders of strength just as much as she did. That night, as she lay in bed, Kayla thought about everything that had happened since the laughter at the football game. The ridicule, the helicopter, the salute, the assembly, the interview, the ceremony, it all wove together into a single tapestry, one that showed her something she had never fully understood before. Her father's lessons weren't just for her. They were for anyone who needed to find courage in the face of doubt, anyone who needed to stand tall even when others tried to tear them down. And as she drifted to sleep, the folded flag resting by her pillow, she knew with certainty that she would carry those lessons for the rest of her life. Spring slowly replaced the chill of winter, and with it came a sense of renewal that Kayla had been waiting for. The snow melted into soft streams along the sidewalks, the trees began to bud with new life, and the air carried the smell of damp earth and fresh beginnings. School was nearing its end for the year, and while most of her classmates were focused on prom, exams, or summer plans, Kayla's heart was still tied to her father across the ocean. She had grown used to the rhythm of waiting, letters arriving weeks apart, moments of silence stretched like threads, and news reports she sometimes turned off just so she wouldn't imagine the worst. But the waiting no longer hollowed her out. Instead, it had shaped her into someone who could stand firmly even when the ground beneath her felt uncertain. One afternoon, as she walked home carrying her backpack heavy with books, she noticed two younger kids from the neighborhood trailing behind her. At first she thought nothing of it, but then she heard one of them whisper, "That's her, the one whose dad's a soldier." The other boy asked, "Do you think he's coming home soon?" Kayla slowed down and looked back at them. They froze, suddenly embarrassed at being overheard, but she smiled gently. "He will," she said firmly. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he'll come home when he can. Soldiers always try their hardest to get back to the people waiting for them." The boys nodded, their eyes wide, and for the first time Kayla realized how even the younger ones in her community looked to her for reassurance. It wasn't just her classmates at school anymore, it was kids, parents, even strangers who saw her story and carried it with them. Later that week, her school counselor asked if she'd be willing to speak at a community event for Military Families Appreciation Month. At first, Kayla hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted to stand in front of more people again, to have her feelings pulled into the spotlight, but then she thought about the woman she had hugged at the base ceremony and the boys who had followed her home. Maybe sharing her story wasn't just about her anymore, it was about giving strength to others who might not know how to find it. So she agreed. On the day of the event, the gymnasium was filled with families, veterans, teachers, and students. Kayla stood on the stage in her simple dress, the dog tags glinting faintly against her chest, and she felt the familiar mix of nerves and pride. When she began to speak, her voice wavered at first, but soon it steadied. She talked about the night of the football game, about the pain of being mocked, and about how one helicopter landing had changed everything. She talked about the weight of waiting, the strength in holding on to hope, and the way her father's lessons carried her even when he couldn't be there himself. By the time she finished, the room was quiet except for the sound of soft clapping that grew into a standing ovation. People weren't just applauding her, they were applauding every soldier, every family member, every person who had learned to endure the silence of distance with dignity. Afterward, a man in uniform approached her. He introduced himself as a recruiter but quickly added, "Don't worry, I'm not here to push you into anything. I just wanted to say that what you shared reminded me of why I joined in the first place. It's not just about the fight, it's about the people we protect back home. And hearing it from someone like you, well, it makes all the difference." Kayla nodded, humbled, and thanked him. That night when she got home, she sat by her window and looked out at the stars. She thought about all the nights her father might be looking up at the same sky from across the ocean. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so far from him. She opened her journal and wrote, "I don't know when you'll come home, Dad, but I want you to know that I'll be okay until then. You've given me everything I need to face this life. And when you walk through that door again, I'll be ready, not as the little girl you left behind, but as the stronger person you've helped me become." The page blurred with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of hope. Weeks passed, and the school year ended with warm summer air and the promise of long days ahead. Kayla found herself sitting on the porch one evening, watching fireflies spark in the twilight. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her glance up, and her heart skipped when she saw her mother's expression change. Surprise, then disbelief, then joy so strong it seemed to light up her face. Kayla turned and there he was. Her father, tired and worn from months of deployment, but alive, smiling and walking toward her with open arms. For a moment, Kayla couldn't move as if her body couldn't believe it was real. Then she dropped everything and ran, colliding with him in a hug that seemed to erase all the distance, all the waiting, all the lonely nights. She buried her face in his uniform and sobbed, not caring who saw or how loud she cried. He held her tightly, his hand stroking her hair, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I told you I'd come home, kiddo. I told you I'd come back." The weeks after her father's return unfolded in a blur of joy, adjustment, and moments that felt almost too good to be true. Kayla woke up every morning to the sound of her dad's voice downstairs, no longer carried through a staticky phone call or written across pages of letters, but real and alive in her home again. Breakfasts became a ritual of laughter, her mother cooking while her father teased her about her growing independence, and Kayla soaking in every second as if afraid it might disappear. At school, her friends noticed the glow in her smile, the weight lifted from her shoulders, and even the teachers commented on how her writing had taken on a stronger, more confident voice. She found herself no longer shrinking under the whispers of others. Instead, she walked the halls with a steady stride, knowing she had faced storms most of her classmates couldn't imagine and had come out stronger. Yet, alongside the happiness, there was also an adjustment period that required patience. Her father had seen things during his deployment that he didn't always talk about, and sometimes at night Kayla could hear him pacing the living room, restless and unable to sleep. Once, she crept downstairs and found him staring at the window, his expression far away. She hesitated before stepping closer, but when he noticed her, he smiled softly and patted the couch beside him. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. Kayla shook her head and sat, curling up next to him. "I just wanted to be where you are," she admitted. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. "You've been braver than anyone I know," he told her. "Stronger than even me sometimes. I don't think I could have done what you did, waiting, keeping faith, carrying yourself with so much dignity." Kayla didn't know how to respond, so she simply leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "I was just trying to make you proud." He kissed the top of her head. "You already have. Always." Those words became a steady anchor for her, reminding her that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had already proven herself. Summer brought warm evenings, barbecues with neighbors, and the slow rebuilding of life as a family. Her father surprised her one morning by suggesting they take a road trip before school started again. "Just us," he said, grinning. "No schedules, no ceremonies, no waiting for letters. Just father and daughter making memories." They packed up the car with snacks, blankets, and music, and for days they drove through open highways, stopping at little diners, exploring quiet towns, and laughing at silly roadside attractions. One night, camped under a sky full of stars, her father pulled out his dog tags and handed them to her. "I want you to keep these," he said. "Not because I'm leaving again, but because they belong with the person who gave me the strength to wear them every day. You kept me going out there, Kayla. These are as much yours as they are mine." Tears pricked her eyes as she took them, holding the cool metal tightly in her hand. "I'll keep them safe," she promised. "Always." That night, under the blanket of stars, Kayla realized that her father's return didn't just mean the end of waiting. It meant the beginning of something new. They weren't the same as before. She wasn't the little girl who had waved goodbye at the deployment gate, and he wasn't just the soldier who had left. They were survivors of distance, carriers of hope, and builders of resilience together. When school resumed in the fall, Kayla stood on the first day with her backpack slung over her shoulder, her father walking beside her to drop her off. As they reached the doors, he paused and looked at her with pride. "You're going to do amazing things," he said. She grinned, feeling the weight of his belief settle warmly in her chest. "So are you," she replied. Inside, as she navigated the crowded halls, she noticed the same whispers still followed her, but they were different now, respectful, admiring, almost reverent. People no longer saw her as just the girl whose dad was away. They saw her as someone who had carried herself with courage and become a symbol of strength. In quiet moments, she would still write in her journal, not out of loneliness anymore, but as a way to capture the pieces of her life she never wanted to forget. One entry, written in neat, careful lines, summed up everything she had learned. "Waiting teaches you patience. Hope teaches you strength. Love teaches you that no distance is too far. And when the waiting ends, you realize you were never really alone. You were always walking together, even if apart." Years later, when she looked back on that summer, the speeches, the moments of doubt, and the reunion on the porch, Kayla knew it had shaped her into who she became. It wasn't just her father's story as a soldier. It was their story as a family, as a daughter who learned to stand tall, and as a reminder that even in the longest nights, the dawn always comes.
The end.